So on Friday, September 27th, I was on my way to work when we get a text that said they had just started receiving 911 calls for Buncombe County. We're their rollover in case they can't answer all of their calls, us and along with several other 911 centers. When I get that text on the way in, it says, hey, we just started receiving 911 calls from Buncombe County and we're already overwhelmed.
When we came into work Friday morning, it was a typical day, and we were not aware yet that we were going to be taking calls for Buncombe County. And at 7:10, the calls started coming in, and with the first call that came in, it was kind of a shock, alarming, stressful, very, very hectic. The calls were coming in back to back to back. I mean, we were receiving more calls than we could take at a time.
I came in and immediately took a console, just answering the phones as quickly and efficiently as I could, helping people navigate the situation. I explained to them that while we were not in their general area, that we were able to handle their calls for service, that we were going to get them help to their area just quickly and safely as possible.
We implemented a new 911 phone system across the state, and we've been on that system close to 2 years. And the idea behind that system is that you could take 911 calls anywhere in the state of North Carolina. And that worked for us. And I am so happy to know that if we ever needed help, if our 911 center became overwhelmed with 911 calls, or for whatever reason, maybe a disaster here, or maybe a problem inside of our 911 center, we had to abandon or evacuate our 911 center, it makes me feel better knowing that our calls can still be answered across the state or any place in the state of North Carolina.
So just not being familiar with that geography, the callers were a little alarmed that Fayetteville was answering calls for their area. So we were having to get them to clarify exactly where they were, not just their street address, but also the city and the county. And as the day progressed, the more serious calls that we were getting, they were all serious, but the ones that were life-threatening, we were having to make sure that the supervisor was aware of those and her communication with Buncombe County to get the resources sent to those people immediately.
I could hear the calls that were coming in. I watched the supervisors as they were calling out calls and typing them back to Buncombe County. They were rescuing people from all of the little cities around Buncombe, around Asheville, Black Mountain, Swannanoa. There was a call where a lady was in her house, was floating down the river.
The one that stood out the most was one of the later calls that I took closer to the time that I left out, and it was a lady, and it was her family, 5 adults, and they were stuck in their house, and she said her house was starting to move and be moved by the water. So she was floating, not necessarily down the river, but the house was moving in the water, and so they couldn't get up to the roof of the house. So she was trying everything that they could to keep everybody safe. And then after I had been talking to her for probably 10 or 15 minutes, the line disconnected and I couldn't get her back on the line.
I then answered a call from a male who was inside of his home. At the beginning of the call, I had no idea the extent of the danger that he was in. He was swimming inside of his house. The water was rising to the ceiling. He could not get into his attic. He did not have stairs to get into his attic. So talking him through trying to get up into the attic, and once he finally got up there, then what? So I talked to him, trying to help him figure out ways to bust through the vent in the attic to get to the rooftop, and he didn't have anything in the attic. Thankfully, a neighbor kayaked up to him with an axe and was able to help him get onto the roof. So I will never forget his name. I'll never forget his address.
We checked the count about 1 o'clock, and we saw about 1,000 calls had come in. We fielded about 1,000 calls. Our telecommunicators, they were just so committed at that point. Nobody was complaining. Nobody was talking about anything other than taking those calls. But as I walked around the room, I kind of looked on their faces, and I could see the heartbreak that they were feeling taking those calls, because You know, I can't imagine if I needed 911 and I made a 911 call and my help was 5 hours away. But everybody on the phone, we explained that to them, that we were going to get the calls back to them back to Buncombe County as quickly as possible. And they were okay with that. They just needed help. All they wanted from us was to get them help.
I think one of the hardest things is not knowing the outcome. We talked to so many people that day, and they were experiencing the scariest moment of their life, situations that I couldn't imagine ever being in personally. And we talked to them, and just not knowing where they are today, how they are, if they made it. That's the hardest part.
For calls like this, of this magnitude, that we don't know what's going to happen, even the after effects of what's happening, because it's very unlikely that we're going to get any kind of follow-up with the actual victims themselves. But our agency has set up counselors to come in and talk with us over the next couple of days. So we do have that outlet to express any concerns and kind of get those kind of things out in the open and try not to bottle them up.
So in 30 years of being with Fayetteville's 911 Center, we've never experienced a call volume like that. We get calls. We've had hurricanes come through. We've had Hurricane Matthew, which is probably the closest to what we experienced on Friday. But just to watch them step in and take 911 calls, it made me proud to know that they were committed, that they were dedicated, that, you know, that they were reliable. They wanted to be there. They wanted to help. And after I sat back and looked at the calls that they took and saw the anguish on their faces, or saw the heartbreaking facial expressions, they got off the phone and started talking about it. You know, we had this one call. We tried to prioritize the calls. And hey, the highest priority call, life-threatening, we're going to put them in a different call. But at the end of the day, all the calls were priority calls. And they knew that, and they got those calls in as quickly as they could. They did everything they could that day to save lives. And that was probably the most proud I've ever been of them.